Welcome, everyone. Am I okay? All right, excellent. I'm Jane Henniger. I have the great privilege to be the executive director of the ACLU of Indiana. And I have a couple of matters of business. I want to thank our sponsors who make these events possible. They include WFYI, thank you very much, Nuvo, Fraser Designs, Printing Partners, and the Center for Inquiry. And we also are enormously grateful to Larry Rubin and the Rubin Family Foundation that makes specifically the First Friday series possible. So at the ACLU of Indiana, this is our anniversary year. For 60 years, we've been protecting civil liberties. And in that effort, we've been winning victories on behalf of women, on behalf of protesters and prisoners, of individuals targeted because of their race or ethnicity, and many, many more. And those victories are not just recorded in court documents and filed away. Those are hard-fought victories, many of which have been fought and won by Ken Falk, the incomparable Ken Falk, who's one of the panelists today. But those victories were for freedom for individuals. And when we have a victory for civil liberties, we change people's lives. Now, my mother, who's 87, can tell the story of nursing a friend in her youth through the ill effects of a botched back alley abortion. And I, fortunately, came of age after Roe v. Wade, and I don't have such dark memories. For 40 years, Roe v. Wade has recognized a woman's right to a safe and legal abortion. But as the ACLU motto reminds us, freedom can't protect itself. And women have always had to fight, and maybe always will, for dominion over their own bodies. And for that and other fights, the ACLU will be here. We'll be here for another 60 years and beyond that, because we're fighting for freedom and we're fighting to change people's lives. So thank you for joining us today. I hope that you come away learning something from today's discussion. And if you are moved by what you learned today, I hope you'll act. There are many ways to act, one of which is consider supporting the work of the ACLU and of Planned Parenthood of Indiana. You can become a member of ACLU, and we've got many ways, you probably noticed them, on your way in to contribute to become a member, and I hope you'll consider that. Your contributions to both the ACLU and Planned Parenthood help us keep up the fight. Now I have the great privilege of introducing my friend and my hero, Betty Cockrum. Now, Betty has led Planned Parenthood for over 10 years. That's right, you just had your 10-year anniversary, Betty. And she has led the organization in a variety of ways. She's led it to financial stability. She's, under her leadership, Planned Parenthood provides some of the best and safest health care in the state of Indiana. And Betty is a voice and a champion for women and for men and for reproductive rights in Indiana. And ACLU is very proud to be a partner to Betty and Planned Parenthood of Indiana in defense of those rights. So welcome, Betty.
Thanks to Jane, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's certainly important to understand the importance of the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Some of us in this room do remember those years before it came to pass, and some of us are pretty stunned that we find ourselves here in 2013 having to revisit those same fights and regird our loins to fight for what we thought was pretty much a done situation. And certainly right now, ACLU and Planned Parenthood and a number of other groups are looking at what's happening in the State House and hoping by advocacy with your support to perhaps avoid some of the outcomes that are not okay for us. I don't want to do any one-upping And I congratulate you at the ACLU of Indiana for celebrating your 60th anniversary, but we just celebrated our 80th. And I think you should take up the same mantra that I've shared time and time again, which is because everybody doesn't love us. And we sometimes wonder if today ACLU of Indiana is less popular than Planned Parenthood. And, you know, we go back and forth. And so I really like saying to these people, you don't get to be around for 80 years unless you are providing something that is valued and needed, and you're doing a pretty darn good job providing it. And that's why you're still here after 60 years, and we'll be for another 60, and that's why we've been around for 80, and we'll be around for another 80. Personally, I'm around because Ken Falk helps us deal with our really difficult situations. The partnership between Planned Parenthood and ACLU of Indiana is about as important as anything that exists for us at Planned Parenthood in our mission on a daily basis. So thank you so much for that. It is now my privilege to introduce our moderator, Maureen Hayden. I would normally not cheat and read, but when I look at that whole list of communities, don't you want, you don't want me to read them? Come on. Thank you. State House Bureau Chief for the CNHI newspapers in Indiana, and I'm one who happens to still be fond of newspapers, even though the Star is the one that, no, I didn't. I love the Star. Anyway, print out there across the state of Indiana, in Anderson, in Batesville, in Goshen, in Greensburg, in Hendricks County, Jeffersonville, New Albany, Kokomo, Logansport, Faro, Rushville, home of Joe Hogsett, the U.S. Attorney, Terre Haute, Lebanon, Washington Times-Herald, and the Zionsville Times-Sentinel. So this woman and her team are out there across the state of Indiana in some little tiny places and some bigger places informing Hoosiers, and we hope they're paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. It's true, I am a print reporter for a group of small and medium-sized newspapers around the state of Indiana, which I will report to you are still making money. Those newspapers still are. Those are places where people still like to buy the newspaper and read it in print, so that's good news. I want to briefly introduce our panel today. I'm going to start with Ken Falk, whom I know, and here's how I'm going to introduce him to you from the lead of a story I wrote about Ken not long ago. And here's how it started. The contents of Ken Falk's office tell a story about what it's like to be the state's leading civil liberties lawyer. He has a drawer full of hate mail along with thank you notes of gratitude, a shelf of rocks that were thrown through his window, and a goose quill pen from the counsel table inside the U.S. Supreme Court in a frame hanging on his wall. The last item is a reminder of a case he argued in front of the nation's high court in 2000, and the ruling handed down in his favor. The justices found it was unconstitutional for Indiana police to set up roadblocks and pull over motorists at random points to conduct drug searches. The court called the practice a violation of Americans' right to privacy. Falk is a legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union here in Indiana, as you know. He's brought many high-profile cases that have infuriated people along the way. His clients have included the Ku Klux Klan, the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, and anti-abortion protesters. But that 2000 roadblock case that I just told you about has been, I think, one of his favorite to talk about because it illustrates, he said, how we tend to take our constitutional rights for granted until we lose them. On this side, here is Dr. Stephen Ivey, who is the Senior Vice President for Values, Ethics, Social Responsibility, and Pastoral Services at Indiana University Health. Dr. Ivey has a master's and PhD from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. He's written a book and many articles that focus on issues of medical ethics and religion and medicine. He also teaches courses in ethics and ethical decision-making through the IU School of Medicine. And I have a friend who told me last night, she's a chaplain at IU Health, often working in the ER room, and she told me that your ethics class was, the most thought-provoking course that she had taken. And in the middle is Raina Nicole. Raina is a human resources management consultant and a writer. She's got a bachelor's degree in sociology, law, and society from Purdue, an MBA from Indiana Wesleyan. And as a quick aside here, she's done some very interesting work unrelated to reproductive justice, but she's done work with ex-offenders, helping them re-enter the workforce. So, having introduced you all, let me just try to frame this a little bit, if I can, quickly. So we've got 40 years after Roe versus Wade, 40 years after that decision decided that women have a constitutional right to abortion. Why, I think the big question is, why are abortion rights still an issue of public policy and debate? So we know a few things now, 40 years later. The Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro-choice research center on reproductive health, they released a recent report and found that more than half of all U.S. women of reproductive age now live in a state that is hostile to abortion rights, whereas fewer than 1/3 did a decade ago. Even so, there's a new Wall Street Journal NBC poll that shows that 7 in 10 Americans think that Roe v. Wade, that decision should stand. And for the first time ever, I think, a majority of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And yet, I'm a State House reporter. I just came from a meeting with our governor. Here in Indiana, we have a governor who I think some could argue is the most overt opponent of reproductive rights in the state's history. We have a State House here where Republicans have a supermajority, made up of members who overwhelmingly, I think, don't you, Ken, would call themselves pro-life. We've got a congressional delegation that is dominated by Republicans. We've got a new U.S. senator who's a Democrat who calls himself pro-life, and and a Republican nominee in Richard Murdoch who, had he perhaps not uttered the God intends remark he made, may indeed be, he might have won that Senate race. Brian Howey is a great political analyst here in Indiana. He's got Howey Politics Indiana, his weekly newsletter, plus a daily blog. And he's written recently about how a pro-choice Republican in Indiana stands very little chance of being nominated or elected to anything above the municipal level. Since Robert Orr was governor, Governor Orr, who some of you may know, Betty probably knows, was indeed a member of Planned Parenthood. So we do also know that this pro-life dominance here in Indiana comes at a time when polling here in Indiana shows that most Hoosiers still support abortion rights. The Bowen Center poll that recently came out was very interesting, and again found that, for example, 52% agreed that abortion should be legal all or most of the time. But that poll also found that 40% polled said that they thought abortion should be illegal in all or most of the cases. So we've got this interesting pull and tug here in terms of what we've got in terms of rights, what we've got in terms of people's feelings about these rights, what's happening on the national level and the state level, and I hope we can speak to many of those things today. I'd like to, if it's all right with you, to start with, Ken, if you could talk a little bit about the Roe v. Wade decision. What led to it, what's important for people to know about it, and if you have a moment, just to also talk about that 1992 decision, which gave states, some rights to limit access to abortion.
Well, the whole notion of privacy, of the right to privacy, arose really beginning the 1890s with a law review article that then lawyer, later Justice Brandeis, wrote with his old law school dean, William Warren. William Warren had gotten upset because the paparazzi of the day had bothered his daughter's wedding. And so he called up his old classmate and said, really, why don't we talk about privacy? And out of this notion of privacy arose all sorts of issues, but one of them, of course, quickly coalesced into a constitutional right to privacy. And it percolated through the 60s. It started earlier with cases dealing with states that abolished the purchase of contraceptives. That case went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found, no, that was unconstitutional. Looking at the notion of liberty, the 14th Amendment talks about our right to liberty, and what the Supreme Court has said is that certain rights emanate from that word liberty, and these are rights that are inherent in our lives as Americans. And one of those rights coalesced around this notion of privacy. And so when Roe versus Wade came up to the Supreme Court after many years of lower court decisions and state court decisions dealing with abortions and different states taking different positions. I grew up in New Jersey where abortion was illegal, but across the river in New York it was legal. What the Supreme Court was presented was the pure question of whether this notion of privacy in some way encompasses the Supreme Court's, encompasses abortion rights. The case was assigned to Justice Blackmun. Justice Blackmun was formerly the lawyer for the Mayo Clinic and had a medical background in that sense. He apparently, according to stories, sort of secreted himself in the law library for months at a time and came up with what now I think people view as sort of this artificial trimester approach, which was that in the first trimester, the state simply could not regulate the decision between the doctor and the patient. In the second trimester, the state could regulate a little bit more. In the third, the state could regulate a lot more in the interest of the fetus. And what the overarching holding was that the right to privacy encompasses the woman's right to choose to terminate a pregnancy. There was immediate uproar, media protests, a lot of pressure, and ending up with a decision in the Casey decision, which refined Roe, got rid of the trimester framework, and instead the question is the state imposing an undue burden? States can put up all sorts of roadblocks. States can have a waiting period. The states can have a preference, as Indiana does in its legislation, for life. It can do a lot of things, but cannot impose an undue burden. And so now abortion controversies center around whether or not something is an undue burden. And what states are doing now in approaching abortions is not so much a frontal assault on Roe anymore, I think, although that's always possible, but on expanding the notion of the state's ability to regulate. We see here in Indiana sort of the vanguard on that and the attempt to strip Planned Parenthood of all of its funding, including Medicaid funding, because it provides abortions with private funding. So states are thinking of different ways of impacting abortion rights in that way. But so now the issue is any particular regulation an undue burden? Is it an undue burden to require abortion clinics to meet very high licensing standards? Is it an undue burden to require all doctors at abortion clinics, many of whom travel in to perform the procedures, to have privileges in the local hospitals? That's where the battlegrounds are across the United States at the current time.
Steve, I wonder if you could speak to this interesting issue of the crossroads then between what we know is the law and what we know about people's personal faith and their beliefs and their ethics. You're there where they meet by working in healthcare, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that and what the different faiths bring to this conversation and the challenges somebody in healthcare faces trying to navigate this.
If law is to establish at least the minimum understanding of who we are as a people, our minimum understanding of what we have, then when we turn to normative ethics, including religious ethics, they tend to establish more of a maximum understanding of who we are, what is the best out of that. And so while law provides a floor, religious and other normative ethics tend to establish a different standard. What we have found that Roe v. Wade did within religious, it radicalized certain elements of religious normative life in some very interesting ways. The second thing, and I'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later, the other part that we see in this is the normative ethic that comes with women's consciousness. While the particular reproductive justice issues, I think this also has to be placed in the fact that 1920, women in the United States became enough of a person that they could vote. That's less than 100 years ago. that there was enough sense of that. The civil rights legislation of 1964, very important legislation, which for the first time declared women could not be discriminated against in the workplace. That was not established until '64. And for this then to follow so quickly upon that I think the entire rise of women's consciousness, women's sense that women have the ability, indeed the inherent right, to choose for themselves such things as, do I want to have sex today? Do I want to not get pregnant today? And if I am pregnant, do I want to bear a child? Those were concerns that only within really my generation have those even been questions that could be supported within public conversation. So I would raise, in terms of normative, both a feminist consciousness, women's consciousness, and differences within religious consciousness. And I'll be happy to pick up that religious theme a little bit later if you'd like.
I would like for you to talk about in a moment. I think we may open this up to the audience in a moment. But some of the challenges that you're facing working through this issue in healthcare. Mm-hmm. But Rain, I want to talk to you about this first. If I've got this right, I think when Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun spoke for the majority in Roe v. Wade, that he described the decision as a necessary step towards the emancipation of women.
Yes.
Which fits into what Dr. Ivey was just saying. And so, Raina, I wonder what you think about that, this phrase of the necessary step towards the emancipation of women, especially since I asked you this before, you're barely old enough. You're not even older than Roe v. Wade. So you've grown up, as I have.
Barely old enough to be here, indeed. Thank you, Maureen, for introducing me, and thank you for those that invited me to participate. As far as the emancipation of women, I guess I have a different perspective on that because of my obvious demographic status. I think that feminism and the strides that feminism made for women, obviously, left out the black female initially. It left out the racial aspect and the class aspect of women. And so the strides that Roe made toward the emancipation of women was just the beginning. As Dr. Ivey mentioned about the 1964 being the first opportunity for women to even be recognized as having the ability to vote. I'm sitting here in 2013 as a black female who gets looks at times when I go to the grocery store. So although we seem to think that we are in a post-racial society, we're not. We're not even in a post-feminism society, because we're still having this discussion about women and their right to choose, and whether or not, as Dr. Ivey said, if we want to have sex today, if we'd like to have a child. And these ideas, to me, are very antiquated. I haven't had the opportunity to speak with my mom about that because my mother's very tight-lipped, about these things. These are things that you don't discuss. And so a lot of times I've had to go outside of the home and discuss with other women, other she-ros, trying to figure out, what does reproductive rights mean? What does abortion mean to women, to young women, to older women? And the answers that you get are different. And so as far as an emancipation of feminism and an emancipation of women, I think that's such a broad term, and it's a conversation that has to continue on a one-on-one conversation in a small setting like this and on the national stage, because if we don't continue to talk about it, people will forget that there are such things as death that occurs from illegal abortions.
Let me ask you one more question before we move on. One of the things that we know, the Guttmacher Institute, again, I think it was from their study, they kind of looked at who is having abortions. And among the things that they found was that unintended pregnancy rates are rising among poor people and falling among higher income people, but that abortion rates are still about 5 times higher among people living below the poverty line. And the rates are also significantly higher among people of color than among white people. So the abortion question, I don't think it can be talked about without talking about larger issues of reproductive rights, access to contraception. What are your thoughts about those kinds of?
I will go back to say that most things in life are rooted in access and resources. If you don't have access to the information, you don't have the resources to pursue whatever it is that you choose to pursue, then you make the choice that is in front of you or that someone has told you is an option for you. I've had conversations with many of my Black friends about whether or not abortion is disproportionately affecting the African American community, if it's just for Blacks and Hispanics and not for Asians and Caucasians. And yes, you cannot ignore the numbers. You can't ignore what the numbers say, that there are more abortions in the Black community, there are more abortions in the Hispanic community than there are in Caucasian and Asian communities. But I think that goes back to, I'm trying to frame this correctly. I think it goes back to how we perceive those individuals as contributors to society. So if we think that Caucasians have more to contribute, if we think that Caucasians have more to contribute to society, then our efforts to prevent one single soul from being lost we do a lot more to prevent that from happening than we do to prevent, the birth of a Black child or the birth of a Hispanic child. I look at that situation and say, for those who are pro-life, my chosen label is anti-choice. So I don't know how offensive that is. But for those of our community who are pro-life, how many children have you taken under your wing that you know is not being adequately cared for? Because if you are truly pro-life, then it's for the life of the child until adulthood, not just the birth. And so oftentimes I look at individuals that say, oh, abortion's wrong. Well, what do you do for that child beyond the birth of that child? There are many who would like to deregulate every portion of society except for abortion and birth. But how many children are you mentoring? How many children are you taking the opportunity to feed them if you see that they're hungry? There are certain social services that are available to children that are lower income, children that don't have access and resources, but yet those programs are being threatened by the same individuals that want to take legalized abortion off the books.
Steve, I want to ask you, I saw you nodding as Raina was speaking, especially at the beginning of her response. What were you thinking as she was talking?
I think she does a nice job of pointing that maybe this is ethnic racial. I tend to believe that it's more a matter of economics, and that it is a matter of a poor woman of whatever race looking at her future as a single woman with very limited support from her personal community or from the larger political community to assist in raising that child, and saying, I can't do this by myself. And any of us looking at raising a child by ourselves should be scared witless by that. And so that a woman in poverty of whatever race, and so I tend to think that it is more a matter of poverty. Unfortunately, still African American and Hispanics are overrepresented in the poverty groups, and so we see that correlation. But I think it's actually more a matter of poverty and the wisdom of a woman saying, I can't do this by myself, and I don't have to. And I totally agree then that on both sides. Now, to be fair, there are some religious groups that are being more active in reaching out to communities and actively providing support to persons over time, to women over time for their children, actively supporting women, and then ensuring good adoptive processes. And so there are some religious groups that would be very actively opposed to abortion that get the poverty piece of this and are engaged. But those are few, and they are not very broad in their engagement.
Ken, I wonder if you can connect something for us, this conversation then about from abortion to reproductive rights to then what happened in the Indiana legislature last year, the bill that they passed to defund Planned Parenthood. And it became then more about than just pulling public dollars for abortion. It became a much larger issue, and I wondered if you speak to that.
Many years ago, Congress passed and the Supreme Court upheld a law which has been continuously reenacted that says, aside from extremely limited situations, you cannot get Medicaid to pay for abortions. Planned Parenthood, only a very tiny percentage of what it does is providing abortion services. Its majority of its work is providing reproductive health services, cancer screening, contraception, all sorts of stuff that has nothing to do with abortions whatsoever. That necessary health services, which Planned Parenthood performs on a larger basis than anyone else in Indiana and probably the country, although I'm fairly Indiana focused, is paid for in part by federal monies and state grants. It's also paid for by private pay. The federal money is funneled through the state, so it is state controlled. And what the legislature passed was a law which said that Planned Parenthood, that any entity that performs abortions, I wonder who they were talking about, cannot get any public funding, period. So what Planned Parenthood was faced was losses of all of its grants, which would have affected thousands and thousands and thousands of women and men who received health care and health services through Planned Parenthood. And it's a very clever approach because it does not attack the right of Planned Parenthood to perform abortions. There's no undue burden. What it does, however, is it punishes the entity for work it does with non-public funds. The bulk of the money that Planned Parenthood would have lost would be Medicaid money. And in fact, the way this worked out is the law was passed and we went to get what's called a temporary restraining order, which is an immediate order. That was denied, so the law actually went into effect. So Planned Parenthood was in a position of losing all that money. Planned Parenthood ended up getting donations from people from all over the country and around the world to fill in the funding gap. So it was a very clever move by Planned Parenthood to get more funding until we were able, I know, is Betty still here? Until we were able to get an injunction to prevent the law went into effect. That was appealed to this Court of Appeals in Chicago, which affirmed the injunction, saying that the law should not go into effect, and now the state is going to be filing a request in 2 weeks for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. So that's where we are with that. And as I said, if you look at where abortion jurisprudence is around the country, you still see frontal attacks on Roe, but more and more you see different ways of attacking the ability of persons to get the procedures.
Steve, you want to add to that?
I would, from the legal to the political, philosophical, I think that's a nice example of the power dynamic still at work in this. That for those able to control, and who can we control? Poor people. So we may not be able to control all women, but we can control poor women still. And so the kind of political, social dimension of that, I think we just have to keep our eyes open to if we're to see what's really happening in front of us. It is a matter of male political power still at work in the social setting.
I wonder if we could open this up to some questions from the audience. One of the reasons why I was so delighted to be able to be invited here was because, as you know, the ACLU talks about this being a civil discussion, and abortion is an often uncivil topic wherever you stand on this. It's a tough conversation to have. One of the things we talked about earlier was the language we use. As a reporter, I'm looking for shortcuts in language, whether that's a good thing or not. It is, and so my default descriptions are pro-life and pro-choice because that's the quick two-word way to say something, and then to get on with the rest of the story. But it's good to have these conversations even as we stumble through the language, I think. So I wonder if there's a question from the audience. I'd like to encourage questions as opposed to statements, if that's all right. Do you have a question for one of our panel members?
Why don't we use more Rosa Parks type situations to go on the offensive as opposed to always playing defense?
That's an interesting question. Well, do any of you want to speak to that?
Lawyers play defense. Not always, but I mean, what we're dealing with here is a right of privacy, and that has been firmly established. So from a legal perspective, obviously not a legislative perspective, from a judicial perspective, the abortion controversy now is always going to be in the frame of someone trying to whittle away that right of privacy. That doesn't answer your question for the rest of the world, but it does from the litigation side.
Is there another question? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
There are small examples of that happening. They are unfortunately small, but for example, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice has an active program among 6 to 10 theological schools to include in the curriculum reproductive choice, and they include in those curriculums affirmative action to go bear witness with abortion centers, to be present and as a peaceful protection for those. There are small cadres of such groups around the country. I do not know of any in Indiana. So that there are examples of peaceful presence to support this from religiously oriented people. There are a handful of those that we could say there's a template to use. The courage to do more is I think where we stumble.
And may I ask you to talk a little bit more about this, this, and if you even accept this premise, that we have a split within ourselves, that for example, the Pew Research Center survey that found that more than 6 in 10 people say they would not like to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade. And yet, that same poll found that about half those people, even though they say they don't want the court decision overturned, about half of them feel personally that it's morally wrong to have an abortion. And I just wonder, is this a right where we are struggling still?
Undoubtedly, and I think even for those religious groups, and the Pew study said that 76% of mainline Protestants, which would be Methodists and Presbyterians, and that group of folk, support Roe v. Wade. There's actually only, and even they found that even 63% of white Catholics support Roe v. Wade. The only 2 religious groups that are in opposition to Roe v. Wade would be white evangelicals and Hispanic Catholics. Those are the two groups. But even among those who would support, there is seldom a broad affirmation of what might be termed abortion as birth control. And so they struggle with that, but they also are very affirming of recognizing that it is a woman's choice, and we will respect a woman's choice, if I take this position, to be wrong. But it's a legal right, and we're going to protect that right because of individual conscience. And so it is that tension I think most religious folk have between an individual conscience, a belief that each individual bears his or her own responsibility, and a kind of legalism that often attaches to religion, and how to keep those two together, that people then do fall into an ambivalent category, and thus in presence of conflict, we go silent.
Raina, what are you thinking as Steve was talking?
It always amazes me. I am a person of faith. I attend church, not just Christmas, Mother's Day, and Easter, but but at least 3 times a month. And I believe what my faith tells me is judge not, lest ye be judged. And so I cannot say what is right for another individual. All I can advocate for is the option, and that there is an option available, a choice available. It always amazes me, and I don't know where the term evangelical got to have such a negative connotation, but it does, and it does in my head. And I know that I oftentimes am a participant in evangelical activities, but I don't know why it has such a negative connotation. But when I have these conversations with other churchgoers, and the piety that they begin to espouse what other people should do, it amazes me that there is not this memory that what God said about loving your neighbor, judge not lest you be judged, and taking care of the very least of these. That goes out the window when people begin to talk about what they believe that someone else should do with their own body.
Are there?
Preach on, sister.
Is there another question from the audience? Yes, sir.
Are the numbers that were given early, the number of abortions in the community of color, are those absolute numbers or percentages of those communities in the total population? And what are the implications either way? And does the male dominance, what effect does that have in answering or understanding those proportions?
I don't know that I can speak to the specific first question. The Guttmacher Institute is where I pulled this information. They do portray themselves as an advocate for reproductive rights, reproductive justice. And so one of their concerns was that there were an increasing number of upper and middle class women who perhaps had access to contraception in a way that they could avoid the abortion question, or we had the resources to pay for an abortion out of our pocket, whereas poor women don't. And so that is, that they were expressing concerns about that. So I don't know, Dr. Ivey, I know you've looked at some of these numbers too.
Is that for across all racial groups, upper middle class?
I don't know. The Guttmacher Institute study is very detailed, and I'm a big Googler, and I'd encourage folks to go to it. Can you speak to some of this?
To a specific question, I would not be able to speak to.
But Mayor, can I ask you really quickly here? Can you, without speaking, I know you're not speaking for IU Health, but you have spent many years working in healthcare and working with folks, trying to work through these issues of ethics and law and medicine. And so where do you find yourself now talking to the folks that you work with in healthcare, whether that's a nurse or a doctor or administrator, as opposed to where you were maybe 40 years ago, 30 years ago when you started this kind of work?
More than 30 years ago is a long time. The theoretical questions that we face and that we try to take public positions on as individuals, as religious groups, as political groups, when it's your own wife, your own daughter, become very different conversations. And thus, where within any of the hospitals where I have served, to not assume that because someone comes in and we happen to know their religious or their social background, that we have any idea how they're going to struggle with this particular decision of a pregnancy that is unwanted for whatever reason, because it's threatening someone's health, because the fetus is not going to survive to birth, whether it's just not a pregnancy at a time in life that we're able to bear, whatever that is. When it becomes a point of very personal decision making, all those things go out the window that I thought I believed. And it becomes very much then a real heart-rendering decision that women and those who are supporting them face at that point in time. So what I have through experience is to pay great attention to each and every person. What we're seeing today is for poor women in particular, not being able to act out of their own conscience because of a lack of resources, both places they can receive the treatment, medical treatment they'd like to receive without going out of state, at which time they don't have the funds to go out of state. Persons of some money means, because of restrictions in Indiana now, find themselves going out of state for actions that poor women simply can't. That's just heartbreaking. And thus, women are limited, particularly poor women, in their choice to execute the rights they have because the support of their community is not available to them. So that's always been present. We could go to end-of-life discussion and have much the same conversation, that what I thought I would believe at this point, all of a sudden, is simply not what is real now. But it's certainly at this point that is true.
We today have gotten a small glimpse of the kinds of conversations that I think are going on. I know we're getting close to approaching the end of our time. We've got just a few more minutes, so I'm going to ask if there's another question from the audience. Yes.
Real quickly, I just wondered what legislative challenges you might anticipate coming now that we have a very Republican, even more Republican, state house and governor.
I think it's all going to be peaches and cream myself. But that's just the kind of person I am. I always look at the glass as being somewhat full. I think at this point there's no way of knowing. I know from talking to Betty there are a number of bills that they're tracking, and I would suggest that you consult with their website for legislative developments. I think, however, as we've stressed, or I've stressed, this is an issue that is very much alive, and it is under attack. And the one thing I always caution people on this issue, and obviously it's an issue that awakens deep feelings, moral feelings, religious feelings, it ultimately is a privacy issue. And it doesn't really make any difference what I think or my opinion is as an individual. In the same way, it doesn't make any difference what my opinion is that you're sending your child to school X as opposed to school Y. It's not my business. And if the Constitution means anything in some thematic way, looking at all the amendments, it is that there are areas of privacy. There are areas that the government says we can't tell you what to say. We can't tell you what to worship. We can't come into your house. That's all privacy. And although the abortion issue excites a lot of vituperation on both sides, ultimately that's what it all is. If we accept there's a right to privacy, and as Americans, that's one thing 100% of us cherish. We define it in different ways. Some of us define it as the right to have weapons. Some of us defines us as the right to be able to vote the way we want or think the way we want. But we all have at our core as Americans an appreciation and a need and a recognition that what we have almost uniquely vis-a-vis our government is this piece of paper, the Bill of Rights, giving us the right to privacy. That's where abortion is. It's part of the right to privacy, regardless of what we think about it.
And I think it's very important to have the male voice heard in this discussion on this topic. I don't know how many of you, when you heard Representative Aiken and Mr. Murdoch. How many? I laughed at first, and then I thought, oh, how sad that those are words that are coming out of the mouths of individuals that want me to vote for them. Maybe not me specifically, but people in my peers to vote for them. And I thought, how dare a man tell me or any other woman what I need as far as the progress of my body and my reproductive health and my health. And then I thought, if we don't have the male voice to weigh in and advocate, as many of you know, some people don't hear your message because they don't like your package. If they don't like your package, they don't hear you. So if you don't have a male voice advocating on a number of issues, then we just become, oh, there's that woman and what she wants, again, so.
No, that's very interesting. I want to tell you a couple of things for folks who want to know more about the legislation that's currently in the State House. Despite Ken Fox's perennial optimism, there are indeed, a number of bills in the legislature that I think folks who work to protect reproductive rights would be concerned about. There's a list of them in the back as you're going out. You'll see a sheet like this that'll give you some details, including who's sponsoring the bill and the legislation. One of the ways to follow this too, in addition to going to the Planned Parenthood website, the Indiana General Assembly has done a good job, I think, of becoming more transparent in what they're doing. You can easily go to the Indiana General Assembly website, Google it, it'll pop right up, and you'll see a list of places where you can go, and it'll say bills and resolutions, and go to that, and you can put in the word abortion, or if you know a particular bill, or if you know a legislator is sponsoring it, it not only will show you that bill, but it's got an action list on it as well, so you can kind of track it as it goes. The Indiana General Assembly does a good job of live streaming, and archiving a lot of the hearings on these issues. So you can follow it in your pajamas at home in front of your laptop as well. So I want you to know that there is a way to do that. I'm going to take one more fast question if you've got one, and then we've got to wrap up. This has been a great discussion, only a beginning. Go ahead, please.
All right. In the discourse, we normally hear issues of God arise, even when the legislators are talking, on the floor and everything. And so, I really believe in the separation of church and state. And so I wanted to ask you guys how much you think this is an issue of separation of church and state, rather than an issue of privacy or women's rights.
Ken, do you want to speak to that?
Everyone has their own life view, and to the extent that your view, because of religion or whatever, is that abortion is terminating a human life, I think it's understandable that that person will push to restrict abortion. I don't think you can say the state of Indiana is adopting a religious position unconstitutionally in its opposition to abortion, even though that is probably where that attitude comes from. But no court has said that merely because you oppose abortions, you are somehow transgressing the separation between a church and state. I think the problem is that you're dealing with an issue that passion runs high because it stems from religious feelings, and that in many ways colors how one approaches the law. But I don't think it is I think it's a mistake to say it's a religious issue. I think it's an issue of interpreting our Constitution.
We've got to end. We're at the end of our conversation. I don't think we are indeed actually at the end of our conversation. I think it's a conversation that I encourage people to have in this kind of manner, but we're at the end of this program. Thank you to all three of you for being with us today, and thank you to this audience for being so civil.
That's us.